right. Well, welcome everyone to the final webinar in the series of discussing LGBTQ inclusive sex education. This one is really focused at the local level. I am seeing some folks on the participation list who have been with us all week long. You all are troopers, like way to put in some dedication. I appreciate that. For those of you who haven't been with us all week, no worries. These webinars are being recorded. They will be featured on the SECUS website. You will get an email when they're ready to be viewed. All of the resources as well and the slides will be available for viewing as well after this webinar. So without any of that, I don't need to take up any more time. I want to introduce my awesome panelists today. The first person that you'll be hearing from is Nora Gelperin, she, her, hers pronouns, Director of Sex Education and Training at Advocacy for Youth, after which we'll hear from Ames Simmons, who is the Policy Director with Equality NC, or North Carolina, and after that, and he, him pronouns, and then Kaitlyn Marchesano, she, her pronouns, with Planned Parenthood Federation of America, who is the Director of Education and Policy. And she's smiling at me, so I think I got that right. So we will move on. I will get off the screen. I'm going to hand it over to Nora and let her take it away. Nora, it's all you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you this morning, this afternoon, whatever time zone you're in. And just thanks to SECUS for hosting such phenomenal learning opportunities for folks. Your week has been amazing and jam-packed, so I'm just really honored to even be part of it. So I thought what I would do for my section of this is start with some 30,000 foot view national stuff and then quickly kind of go down to the district and then even to the building and the individual level, mostly from my perspective, supporting schools around sex education nationwide for, I don't know, too many years to count. So just wanted to start with a nod to the second edition of the National Sexuality Education Standards. Just for folks who've maybe not seen these before, we just released an update and they're not required, so I like to be clear about that, but they are voluntary guidance for school districts and also state departments of education. And they really sketch out for folks across different grade bands the minimum essential knowledge and skills that we hope all students will have upon graduation when they're done with their K-12 schooling. So a couple of pieces of data. The original ones came out in 2012, so quite some time ago. They were long overdue for an update, which with SECUS's help and Planned Parenthood and many other esteemed colleague organizations and individuals, we were able to release those just before COVID shut the whole world down. So back in March 2020. So it's exciting that they're out. We were also excited to see data that just over 40% of US school districts report that they use the National Sex Ed standards to influence either district level policy or curriculum selection. So that was pretty exciting to us that that many schools were actually using them. And I'd just like to highlight some of the different strands in the new edition of the standards, particularly those, I don't know why they're showing up in green and black, but anyway, exciting colors there. Really, one of the big changes I wanted to make sure to draw your attention to for this version of the standards is that we separated out, sexual orientation from gender identity. Before, it had been lumped together under identity by itself, and that obviously was no longer helpful or accurate. And so we really were able to tease those apart and articulate much more clearly across kindergarten through 12th grade what those educational objectives would be across both of those topic areas. So invite you to take a look at those. I know Jennifer said she's going to post them on the resource list. So I think you'll be really interested to see what's in there and hopefully find it useful for your work with schools in your communities. So then one of the other resources I just wanted to make sure folks are aware of, this has been around for a few years now, so I think it's familiar, but I would just like to mention it. It's our free K-12 sex ed curriculum based on the National Sex Ed Standards called Rights, Respect, Responsibility. Often people just refer to it as 3 R's, so you may have heard that more than actually what it stands for. It's really our philosophy that young people have the right to sexual health information, they deserve our respect, and we we as adults and professionals have a responsibility to ensure that young people have what they need to make sexually healthy decisions now and into the future. So that's the philosophy that really undergirds the entire curriculum. As I mentioned, it's free, which is, one of the nice things that people are always like, wait, what? And so just to mention that currently we are updating to align it with the second edition of the National Sex Ed Standard. So we're writing about 30 new lessons that will be released in January of 2021, fingers crossed. And that will supplement the 80 existing lessons. So it's going to be like the biggest curriculum you've ever seen. Most schools pick and choose from all of the lessons. Obviously, very few schools have enough time to do all of those lessons. A handful do, which is spectacular, but most schools just kind of pick what their priorities are, what they think their communities are going to prioritize across those different lesson plans. The website is 3rs.org. You're welcome to download all the lessons. Some of the lessons, they come ready to go, and they're fully adaptable. So we know there was no curriculum that was going to meet the needs of all young people. So we really kind of think of it as a starting point for schools, and lots of community-based organizations use it as well. And we actually encourage and invite you to adapt it to make it stronger for the young people that you're working with. Again, we recognize it's just really a starting point, but it's certainly not going to meet the needs of everyone. And just to point out something that's a little bit different about this curriculum than some others, it's not intended as a teen pregnancy, HIV, STD standalone curriculum. So in that sense, it's truly comprehensive. It also frames sexuality as a positive, normal, natural part of being human, which I think is pretty radically different from some other curricula. And lastly, to pertain to what we're talking about today, it obviously has standalone lessons on sexual orientation and gender identity. And we also make sure that those concepts are threaded throughout all of our lessons. So a lesson on family diversity in the K2 grade band would make sure there are families with 2 moms and 2 dads. Relationships in middle school, make sure that we actively affirm and talk about relationships between 2 men, 2 women, someone who's bisexual, someone who's transgender, someone who's gender nonconforming. We really try to make sure that we allow all students to see themselves and their families in this curriculum, in addition to having standalone lessons on those topics. So just know that that's available. I hope folks will take a look at it and see if any of it might be helpful for you. So those are kind of the 2 national kind of big pieces I just wanted to mention. And then kind of looking down at the school district level, I wanted to just share some of the things that I have found to be helpful when working on these issues in public schools. Some of these are probably going to be like, no duh, to many of you who do this work, but I think many of them just kind of bear repeating. So I hope you'll indulge me as we just kind of go through some of these things that I know I've learned over my time working in public schools. So one of these things is, surprise, there's never enough training or professional development. I think oftentimes folks who end up working in schools are incredibly passionate and creative and rarely get the luxury of sufficient pre-service or in-service training. So we know that this is a topic area that also evolves very quickly. So a training particularly around gender identity may look very different 6 months ago than 6 months from now. So it just really underscores the need to continually provide opportunities for professional growth and development, and not think what you got in college when you were learning to be a teacher 20 years ago, 10 years ago is going to be sufficient for what young people need today. We also know that there's really a lot of good intent. That's probably the biggest group of people that I work with, very well-intended educators and school staff and school social workers, psychologists, all those amazing folks. But they oftentimes don't have the budget, don't have the sub coverage, don't have the ability to get themselves to a webinar, to a conference, aren't able to actually attend some of those PD opportunities that may be out there. So we need to really think creatively about how we can meet them where they're at. We also know that even if there's no change to a curriculum, right, there are some states for which a change around putting these topics into the curriculum may be rather seismic. And so we know even if that's off the table, making sure that all of the staff at a school have training can really help them just change their language, change their understanding, change their level of empathy around dealing with students and students' families. So it's not always that we're coming into a school and saying, we need you to change something and do something radically different. That's great if it's possible. But sometimes it's really just, we need you to change the language. We need to make sure that you're respectful of folks' pronouns, those kinds of things. So that's why one of the reasons why training is so important. And lastly, just while I'm talking about training, I just like to always make a plug that it shouldn't just be the folks providing instruction. It should be the guidance counselors and the school nurses and the social workers, and it should be the folks that work in the cafeteria and that provide the after school programs. It really should be a fully inclusive set of training opportunities so that everybody who touches the lives of young people has the most up-to-date information that we can possibly provide. Another point I just wanted to make is that I think sometimes we often fall into the trap of just thinking about this related to adolescents and teenagers. And a particular passion of mine are the little ones. We really know that our youngest students really also need and deserve, obviously, inclusive sex ed. And I know that is usually scary for some people or feels a little like too wild and crazy. But we really know that there's so many opportunities for young children to learn about these topics in age and developmentally appropriate ways. There's great resources out these days that didn't exist even just a couple of years ago. And so we know that even just something with, starting around thinking about what a school is doing on puberty. Usually there's at least hopefully one lesson on puberty. So to think about, is that an opportunity to engage a school on what they're doing for transgender and gender non-conforming youth? What does that puberty education look like? How are they making sure it's inclusive? How are they making sure it's safe? Are they dividing by gender? Please no, but so many schools do. So that can be a great way to kind of hook in with the school and really start to engage them on those conversations. Additionally, sometimes it's really just taking baby steps. Sometimes it's just talking about a variety of family configurations and making sure we've got families with 2 moms and 2 dads, and lots of different configurations are included in there. Also just talking about whether there is division around puberty education, that old like boys go here, girls go here, we close the blinds. That is still done in a surprising number of schools. So it's really helpful to ask if that school is still using that kind of outdated method and encourage them to consider something more inclusive, something safer. It's really not recommended or in the best interest of students to be separated around gender for lots of reasons that I'm sure many of you know, but it can be a way to just really start thinking about what our schools are doing and how we can help them. Couple of other ideas. If folks aren't familiar with a project of Advocates for Youth Answering Youth Tech Health, I'd like to just make sure you're aware of Ames. And this is one video that I actually use far more in training than I do have schools adopting it for use in schools, although I wish, maybe we'll get there someday, but it's a video particularly around puberty and transgender youth that really talks about puberty blockers, that talks about different decision points and ways to get support. I think that we need to make sure that at least our instructional staff and our folks, our professionals in schools and communities are aware of these issues and have some understanding and language and some fluency around this, so that at the very least they can be share that awareness in their instruction, even if it's not a particular lesson, it's just really broadening their understanding. So I encourage you to check out amaze.org. There's tons of free videos around sexual orientation and gender identity. It's really targeted about 10 to 14-year-olds and their parents and caregivers. So just like to acknowledge some other free resources, particularly for young people. A couple of other thoughts, really, as I mentioned before, looking beyond who provides instruction and things not just around people who do one-on-one counseling, which is great, social workers, school nurses, school psychologists, but also thinking about what referrals exist within the school. Who are they getting sent to? What are the healthcare providers, and are they proficient in, making sure that they provide inclusive care for young people? Are they referring to particular support groups? Are they aware of maybe a GSA in the community that's maybe not in the school, or those kinds of things? There's just some issues up and beyond instructional issues that are important to be thinking about when we work with local schools. And I found one of the most helpful things that I can do for K-5 is, again, to not necessarily start with lesson plans. It would be great if we get there, but really to help teachers look at so many teachable moments that come up in the classroom when teachers observe kids acting a certain way, when kids ask questions about their bodies or the bodies of others, or, pronouns, or all those kinds of things that are just happening in our popular culture. These kinds of teachable moments can be great to help educators provide some good information in a variety of ways. So just really thinking about those things as well. And then obviously policies come up. I know that my two esteemed colleagues will talk much more about policy, so I just wanted to mention it's a lot more than just bathrooms, which I think is what a lot of people kind of focus on first. So obviously thinking about dress codes and field trips and chosen names and all those kinds of things really make this issue in particular really important to have clear policies that have been refreshed and are available to all staff so that they are actually familiar with the folks that will be using them. And lastly, just a recommendation, again, this is all about baby steps in K-5 grade levels, is to think about the classroom library that many classroom teachers have. Are there books that we can supplement that library with, or make sure that there's different kinds of children's literature that shows a variety of characters and storylines? There's a really great group called Hope in a Box, which is an organization that actually provides literature to librarians and ELA teachers in rural areas in particular. They're doing some really terrific work around literature specifically, so encourage you to give them a check if you're not familiar with them. And then lastly, I think this might be a good kind of segue over to my colleagues, is to really just think about at the school district level, all of these policies generally exist, and if they don't, schools should be thinking about them because we know that if there's not a policy, oftentimes teachers feel really, they overly censor themselves. They won't go out on a limb for fear of the controversy or the backlash. But if there is a policy on the books that's been board approved and passed, then they do feel more empowered to kind of take on some of these more potentially controversial, or, that's the perception anyway, that these are controversial issues, and make sure that they do offer things like after school clubs, or show up at a school function and know what the policy is related to dress code, or who someone can bring as their date, all those kinds of things. So just to be thinking about instruction as one level, and then policies that kind of wrap around that instruction at all these different levels. So I'm going to stop there, make sure that I share the mic, so to speak, with my colleagues. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and thanks for your participation. I look forward to chatting with you at the end.
Thank you so much, Nora. I am going to share mine, and let's get Ames' presentation up and running. There we are. Ames, can you see that?
I can see it. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you for having me, Jennifer, and I'm really honored to be talking alongside folks who have so much knowledge, depth, and expertise in this field. So thanks again for having me. Jennifer, are you able to advance the slides?
I can. Are you seeing the Healthy Youth Act 2009 on your screen?
No, I still see Sika's cover slide. In fact, it's in your your Google Slides still.
Ah, okay. Let me stop this. Apologies, everyone. Did that work?
It did not work for me. I don't know if other folks I'm
So
still.
no worries, Noelle is chatting me. I may actually have Noelle. Yep, Noelle's going to take over for me. Thank you so much. She's going to handle this for me. Noelle, you're doing that, correct?
Yep, sorry, y'all, just getting stuff pulled up right now.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead and give some context while the slides themselves are pulling up. So my name again is Ames Simmons. My pronouns are he and him. I am a queer, white, transgender guy, and I work as policy director at Equality North Carolina, which is a statewide advocacy organization for LGBTQ North Carolinians. In North Carolina, I know this is a local focused webinar, but I want to set a little bit of the context of policy here. In North Carolina, we do not have any statewide non-discrimination laws in education or in anything else. In fact, we have a fairly aggressive voucher program that we know is allowing public tax dollars to go to private schools that some of which openly discriminate against LGBTQ student applicants, and some of which have explicitly anti-LGBTQ curriculum that is part of them. This is also, of course, the state that HB2 was passed in, and I remember when I moved to North Carolina, one of the first things that, one of my first job duties was becoming a nonprofit lobbyist at the state legislature. So we were working on the repeal of HB2 when the Federal Department of Education rescinded the guidance around trans students in restrooms. And I was at the legislature when that rule rescission was announced, guidance rescission was announced. And I just happened to be at the front door where there was a line of probably 50 elementary school kids who were filing into the General Assembly building to go have their civics tour or whatever. And I just remember looking at those young people and thinking, there's no doubt a trans young person somewhere among those 50 youth who is not gonna have the kind of education that their family likely wants for them to have because of some of the actions that are being taken by the federal government. Just a couple of additional things. With respect to chosen name, I know this is something that is ongoing across the country, and our education policy director, Rebby Kern, is watching the webinar today, and they have done a lot of advocacy along with our colleagues at Campaign for Southern Equality on trying to modernize Power School so that it doesn't out trans students and really allows for students to show up as who they are. So I've painted a really bleak picture. HB2 was repealed. It was not entirely repealed. Our work isn't done there. That's a subject for another webinar. We do have two bright spots of statewide legislation for students. And when I first moved here, everyone talked about how it was awesome that we have the School Violence Prevention Act here in North Carolina, which requires enumerated policies against bullying. So all schools are supposed to have policies that specifically say that students will not be bullied on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, and that includes cyberbullying. We have a whole separate project where we're actually looking at to what degree the 100 counties in our state are actually complying with the School Violence Prevention Act. The other piece of legislation that folks were really excited about is the Healthy Youth Act of 2009, which is this slide, this first slide that you see here. And I know this isn't a legal webinar, so I didn't want to make you read a whole bunch of dense language, but I wanted to point out a couple key things about the Healthy Youth Act. So if we're thinking about what is the benefit of working toward better sex ed at the local level as opposed to the state level, in North Carolina, it is because the state enabling legislation particularly calls out local school administrative unit. So most of education policy in North Carolina is decentralized in that way. So it makes local action like the place where action actually is. So the good things about the Healthy Youth Act, among other things, it requires that a reproductive health and safety education program provides factually accurate information that is objective and based on scientific research that's peer-reviewed and accepted by professionals and credentialed experts. So there's a lot of good kind of model legislation language that made its way into the Healthy Youth Act. And I was like, all right, this is awesome. Noelle, would you put it on the next slide, please? Then I was like, oh, it says they have to teach that a mutually faithful, monogamous, heterosexual relationship in the context of marriage is the best lifelong means of avoiding STIs, including HIV. So that is not such a great part of the Healthy Youth Act. Additionally, one part that was built into this curriculum is parental involvement. So the act says that each local board of education will adopt a mechanism for parents or guardians to withdraw their child from instruction. So this is what's called the opt-out. It is better than opt-in, but I think that particular clause there is one that makes the Healthy Youth Act often come into the sights of folks who are not in favor of comprehensive sex education that is LGBTQ affirming in North Carolina. Noelle, would you put the next slide, please? So I want to talk, I'm just going to give you one example of a local school board. So this just came across our inboxes at Equality North Carolina. Onslow County is out toward the eastern part of our state. It is not an urban school district. And one of the candidates for school board that we work closely with forwarded us this survey that they had gotten as part of running for the school board there. So you can see that in the first sentence of this survey, they say that this group has a mission to advocate for sexual risk avoidance education. And that we know is another way of saying abstinence only education, which has been proven to be ineffective. This survey is really notable for how brazen I think it is about asking school board candidates to commit to either ideology that would inform how they would approach sex education for young people, or it specifically calls out the kinds of sex ed that they would want a school board member to be in favor of promulgating or putting out. So I picked the ones from the end of the survey just so you could see you could only choose yes or no for these. So you have to say yes or no if school board meetings should continue to open with prayer, yes or no, do you believe biology determines gender? And yes or no, are you pro-life? All right there together, juxtaposed with each other. I meant to say that some of these statements might be hard for people to read or to hear. So definitely take care of yourself, because it was hard for me to read them. And I've included these mostly so that you have an idea of what advocacy looks like in more conservative states, like in the South. Noelle, will you advance the slide, please? So here are some other pieces of the questionnaire. So it's advocating for opt-in to sex education if it is going to include anything related to sexual orientation or gender identity, which are, you know, part of the national sex ed standards that Nora was just talking about. And then right next to that, we see children should be protected from exposure to pornography. So it really, there's not a conclusion that you could otherwise draw than that, that educating about sexual orientation or gender identity is tantamount to pornography in our schools. We see it again in another portion of this questionnaire where it says pornography and explicit sex content should not be available through school websites. And that is coded language for students should not be able to access the Human Rights Campaign Foundation's website, GLSEN, Gender Spectrum, probably Advocates, I would guess, would be blocked. Right after that, you have to say whether or not you would be in favor of books that promote homosexual or transgender behavior. And you have to say whether or not you believe that that suggesting to children that they can choose their gender is child abuse. Definitely another legislative trend that we're seeing in the South when it comes to providing trans-inclusive healthcare to folks who are under age 18. Would you advance the slide, Noelle? Thank you. Just another couple of examples. Any student questioning their gender should be taught the medical dangers of using puberty blockers. I'm just going to leave that there. Those are, of course, completely reversible interventions for young people. Right next to that, all students should be taught about the high rate of suicide among those identifying as trans, and that most young people who identify as trans ultimately come to accept their, quote, biologic sex. I think this is really, really, really important, because we are getting really close to what we advocate against as conversion therapy, or attempts to change a young person's sexual orientation or gender identity. And that's been a whole subject of advocacy for us at Equality North Carolina as well. So you have trans juxtaposed with suicide. And just picking up a couple more of the points that, that Nora told us were an awesome part of Advocate's curriculum. If you want to be on the school board in Onslow County and get these folks' endorsement, then you have to agree that schools should not teach children that they have rights to sexual pleasures. Right next to that, we're talking about the biological sex of the student using restrooms. So we're talking about sexual pleasure right next to trans students using the restroom. And then immediately following that, we're talking about trans athletics, which we know is another subject that has been sweeping through state legislatures during this session. I know this is not that webinar, you had that yesterday, but again, you have the implication there by putting sex right next to restrooms that there's something sexual that happens when a trans student is in the restroom, which just plays into this trope that that trans people are predators when it comes to restrooms, and that's partly the kind of ideology that got HB2 enacted into law here. I think that is the last one. Noelle, will you advance one more? Yeah. So I just want to end by saying that we definitely do not do this work by ourselves in North Carolina. One of the leading organizations in North Carolina is called Shift NC, Sexual Health Information for Teens. And we have worked closely with Shift NC as well as with Planned Parenthood. Onslow County specifically, the folks that have the questionnaire that I was just pointing out had a sex ed curriculum that came from Planned Parenthood. And I believe that Shift NC was training, was providing the training around that curriculum until they voted to remove it. And then after that happened, so did their neighboring county, Cumberland County. So in addition to Planned Parenthood and Shift NC, we also, the North Carolina AIDS Action Network was involved in that advocacy, some of the LGBTQ youth serving organizations, but also some of the generally, like, broader speaking child serving organizations have been involved in looking at the policy and advocacy around sex education. And I think that's especially important in a conservative state, that organizations like NC Child or the Pediatric Medical Society, if you have a healthy schools portion of your state education department or state board of education, those are also places where you might be able to find allies in trying to put good policy forward. I have other thoughts, but I am going to save them to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ames. I think many of us are kind of taking a collective breath after everything that we just saw right there. That was shocking, to say the least. So I'm gonna ask Kaitlyn to join me on camera. Hiya, friend. How are you? You're muted.
When will that stop being a thing that I do? Hello.
4 months into this thing, and we're
still doing it.
It's rough. So Kaitlyn and I are going to kind of walk through a dialogue, talking about localized policies. I'm going to encourage you all to start thinking about questions you have for all of the panelists. In a second, Ames and Nora will come back on screen and we'll do a Q&A. So if you want to go ahead and start putting in your questions to be answered in the question and answer box, we'll start generating those, and once they come back on, we can ask all of the questions. So Kaitlyn, you work on federal, state, local policies, and one of the things that I've noticed is that folks in the field love the federal level, right? Federal is where it's at. They think it's the sexy policy space. What's your response to folks when they're like, I want to, how can I go talk to my member of Congress? What can I be doing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jennifer, and that's definitely my experience as well. And I know I said I wasn't going to do this, but I put together a couple of quick slides just to actually talk through that very thing.
Do it.
So I'm just going to share my screen real quick and walk through some of this. Just let me know if you can let me know when you can see my screen. That would be amazing.
Yeah.
You can? Right on. Okay. So first of all, I just want to say hello and introduce myself. My name's Kaitlyn Marchesano. She, her pronouns. I have the privilege of working with all of the Planned Parenthood affiliate education departments across the country. And I know some of y'all are on this call. Hey, I love you. Thank you for doing the work you do. And where I sit at the national office, I have, I think, the privilege of sitting at the juxtaposition between the juxtaposition of education, sex education policy and sex education practice, and seeing the ways in which they align, the ways in which they don't, and the opportunities in the space in between them. And so I just quickly wanted to run through some like top line state level information. And for those of you that have been participating in these amazing webinars all week, I recognize that some of this may be repetitive, so I will keep it moving quickly. But just that at the state level, there are a growing number of states that have specific LGBTQ inclusive language in their sex ed laws. And there are also still states that have really harmful homophobic and transphobic sex education policies. And that's clear. And also that just because there is a state level policy on the books does not necessarily mean that what young people are experiencing in the classroom aligns with that. And so, you know, looking at this map that was put together based on the school health profiles from the CDC, we can see that even in some of the states where these laws are what we consider to be the gold standard, right? The thing that we're aiming for, that like the reality doesn't always match up to what is on the books. Looking at a place like California, and I'm also going to name that these are from 2016, and things have shifted a little bit since then. But that even in some of the states that we look to as, you know, these like places where, oh, well, like we've figured this out, like we've done the thing at the state level, that's not exactly what young people are experiencing. And in some of these states that we think of as being particularly hostile, there are opportunities, or there are situations where young people actually are receiving more affirming and inclusive sex education than maybe we might assume that they are. And what that comes down to is school districts. School districts are where the rubber meets the road. And so, Jennifer, to your point, you know, federal sex education actually beyond kind of funding, and even that is pretty limited, doesn't really do a whole lot in terms of dictating what sex education can and should look like. That is very much like most education policy left up to the discretion of the states. And then a step further than that, most states punt this issue to their local districts and say that, you know, beyond kind of very basic parameters, school districts really get to make the decisions around what the curriculum looks like, who they can partner with to provide sex education, what training and professional development for teachers who are providing sex education looks like. All of this happens at the district level. And so from where I sit, really making sure that you understand and are deeply embedded in what's happening in your school districts is the biggest way that you can contribute to creating safer spaces for LGBTQ young people. I also want to acknowledge that wins at the state level, while really exciting, can still be complicated when it comes down to the district level. And this is not to call out any one state in particular, but thinking about states that often folks in other places are like, wow, I wish I lived here. It's so much easier. At the district level, there has been real hateful and harmful pushback against sex education laws that have been passed at the state level, and often really centering on LGBTQ young people and the inclusion of LGBTQ content as being something around which folks are organized to push back against these sex education laws. And then also, school districts are where we can be innovative and lead the way to state level change. And so thinking about places like Austin, thinking about places like New York City, and even places like Niagara Falls, which is not necessarily a place that you would immediately assume has, you know, has a very strong sex education policy, or maybe you do. But district policy is where we can really think through how to build a framework for change at the state level. So I'll just pause there, Jennifer, and we can go back to talking. But I wanted to share some of that, just to kind of name that there is a lot of potential to do really wonderful things at the district level. And that's actually where change can happen if we are attentive.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and own that in my fabulousness of this webinar, I too did a wardrobe change. I'm just going to go ahead and match it with you so that we are both matching there. Yeah, so I hit a wardrobe change.
I love it.
As part of this webinar, and so throwing it out there.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to bring Nora. Nora, do you mind jumping on camera? Because and Ames, you can jump on. We'll just go ahead and bring both of you on here. I love it, Ames. Be the change I want to see. This is it. This is the change I want to see. So, when we start thinking about policies and like sex education for LGBTQ young people within the classroom, one of the things that immediately comes in my mind is like who's teaching or facilitating these things. And we talk about kind of the federal level where the funding becomes available, so it opens the door for such organizations such as crisis pregnancy centers to come into the classroom and teach sex education. Why is that problematic? Why is that harmful? And what have you seen there? Kaitlyn or Nora?
Do you want me to jump in, Kaitlyn? You want to get
Sure.
going?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So crisis pregnancy centers have a hugely problematic ideological approach to sex ed, which is to promote a religious indoctrination around heterosexual marriage promotion and to convince people to not have abortions at all. So I think oftentimes they're kind of a wolf in sheep's clothing. A lot of school administrators don't recognize the harm. They use language that they're not familiar with. As Ames pointed out, sexual risk avoidance is code for abstinence only until marriage, but a lot of folks may not know that and think it sounds lovely, or be so overworked and underpaid and overstressed that a guest speaker who could do 6 periods of my 9th grade health class for free, and they all get t-shirts, is great. So I think there's a lot of reasons why they're problematic, and for us, one of the biggest priorities is to educate your decision makers at the district level so they understand what is truly behind some of these guest presentations from Crisis Pregnancy Center. So Kaitlyn, what would you add?
Yeah, I think the wolf in sheep's clothing metaphor is a really apt one, and that, there is this infiltration and kind of cloak of respectability that CPCs are increasingly able to don when approaching school districts. And that's, that is one place where I would say federal policy and funding actually does play a role, as some of these funding streams at the federal level are starting to actually give money to crisis pregnancy centers to do teen pregnancy prevention programming, to do sexual health education. That kind of having that stamp and that funding stream then allows kind of the mainstreaming of what really is this radical you know, homophobic, transphobic, anti-choice, you know, framework to come into schools under the umbrella of, well, we're a federally funded sexual health education provider, you know, and to Nora's point, they, you know, to come in and say, hey, I'm happy to provide, you know, free education for your teachers who maybe don't want to be teaching this topic in the first place because they haven't been trained or given any meaningful professional development and have been told, you know, 2 weeks ago that they're going to be teaching sex education, which is often the case. And so I think that it's so important to think through beyond the actual content of what sex education looks like, to be looking at who is teaching sex education, what guest speakers are allowed to come in, you know, who is getting, you know, how are we investing in more long-term and sustainable sex education instead of relying on external folks to come in and pinch hit, when really we should be deeply embedding this in the same way that we have math and history and, you know, physical education. So that was a long way to get to the point of saying, yes, what Nora said.
If only there was a guide to help school districts and administrators to know what health educators are like, who should be teaching sex education. Does anyone know of such that's going to be around or available? Or
you mean like a toolkit for schools, Jennifer? Is that what you're talking about? That maybe
I think that's what I am. Nora, can you tell me about
Cardia are putting together right now? Yeah. We were just copy editing it. It's top of mind. But yeah, a joint project between SICUS and Advocates for Youth and Cardia Services and some WISE grantees that I work with. We're almost done putting out a toolkit for schools so they can better understand some of the co-opted language that CPCs use to try to infiltrate schools. So it should be out, I would say, hopefully within a month. We'll push it out for folks so they can get it if they want it.
Thank you. So this week we had someone talking about GSAs and the research, and this is for anyone, any one of you can answer this question. But I guess my question is, so we talked about GSAs. How could GSAs be a resource when it comes to inclusive sex education? So the person this week talked about the research behind GSAs, but like, I'm curious how if either seen GSAs really work and have been supportive around sex education, like what are your interactions there and thoughts around that? And this is, again, for any of you.
I don't
want to go for it.
I think we're all like, no, you go. No, you go.
Yeah, you know, I feel like it.
So I'm happy to jump in. I think GSAs are an incredible resource for sex education. They often have intrinsically motivated staff who have the right disposition to work with young people on these complex and nuanced topics. Sometimes we see a lot of referrals between sex education teachers and GSA advisors, lots of support, lots of ability to kind of share and leverage resources. I've even seen GSA advisors go on to become the instructors of sex education because some of the health PE teachers or science teachers were so uncomfortable that there wasn't enough training in the world that would get them to be an effective instructor. So I think GSAs play a really pivotal role. Even, I'm sure your research folks shared this, you know, even if they're not fully active, even if they're just kind of like signage and a space that occasionally some kids show up, just the fact that they exist is really, you know, the secret sauce and how helpful they can be.
So Ames, for folks who are working in southern states, like that's been kind of the push. Like, so I know in my home state, Alabama, they are really working to remove the harmful LGBTQ language out of the state law. What recommendations would you have for either southern states or more conservative areas, local districts, more conservative districts? Where would you advise folks to start in this work?
So one thing you can do if you are trying to figure out like what is even a first step that I could take at the local level is you could do a online search for the website of the local school district And when you get there, you can look around to see things. I would search for things like, do they have a non-discrimination statement? I would look at, do they have a bullying statement? Because I was telling you, like, the anti-bullying law in North Carolina is a great law, and I think some school districts have been able to put in, you know, some additional language under bullying that it creates a more inclusive environment for students under the rubric of making sure they're not subject to bullying. And also look on that school board website and see what kind of policy do they have around diversity, inclusion, and equity. Sometimes, so it's good to know what there is before you try to figure out where you need to go. A lot of times, I guess this may be in more urban school districts, are funded well enough to have an equity office. And oftentimes there are allies there. I was surprised the county that I live in, Wake County, it's one of the biggest school districts in North Carolina. Their equity office is tiny. I think they either have 5 or 6 people for 160,000 students. But the person that I got connected with came to work there after being at Southern Poverty Law Center, and turned out to just be a wonderful ally. And then sometimes that door might help you figure out if there is a member of the local school board who's more open to being approached. And that's sort of the direction that we took in Wake County. And that didn't solve all of the problems, but it certainly helped us get an idea of what the dynamics are of the school board, who the players are, when do they have meetings that you could go to if you wanted to talk about sex ed. But I think in the South, you do well to do a lot of that homework before you just show up at a school board meeting, because you may find a very hostile environment and things might land better if you lay some groundwork ahead of time.
So Nora, for you, we talked about like how we can get started even with policy. You work with a lot of school districts and getting curricula in and like getting it institutionalized, if I'm trying to use some more wise words. What are some recommendations there? Like if folks are working at a local level, they're wanting a certain curricula or push back on a curricula, what have been some strategies that you've seen?
Sure. Well, I think first it's helpful, just as Ames was just saying, to ask before you provide an answer, because sometimes what's listed on a district website is dated or inaccurate or not fully reflective of what's happening in a school district. And I've always fascinated that even building to building and teacher to teacher in the same building, there can be wide variation of what kind of lesson plans are being used, what curriculum's being adopted. There are some schools that will not provide the same curriculum across the school district level for a variety of reasons, Kentucky being an example. So I think first it's important to ask what is being taught and to ask folks to share. Usually there's a right for parents and caregivers and community members to access what's being taught to students in a public school, and they can request those materials and go check them out. And then if it's like a prepackaged curriculum, usually there are pre-existing reviews that have already been done by some of our organizations that people can access. If it's more of a homegrown curriculum where a teacher has kind of pulled lesson plans and created some and kind of created their own thing, then that might require a more in-depth review. I remember I worked with a curriculum director for a large school district in Florida who had no idea about some of the bias and judgment in their own curriculum because they just didn't understand that calculating the costs of a baby wouldn't be a great idea to prevent teen pregnancy. Let's do math, right? And it's like, oh God. Or talking about what an awful decision is to have sex could be problematic for people that are survivors of sexual assault. And so to really start to help decision makers, whether that's the classroom teacher or whether that's someone at the district level, understand what can be concerning and problematic about some of the language or some of the activities, particularly if you've got like a program like Choosing the Best, which is widely used in the Southeast. It's incredibly heterosexist and it's thinly veiled heterosexual marriage promotion, but I think unless you have a very what's the right word, like trained eye, some of these things you might not pick up on. So I think in that situation, if that's not training that you already have or your organization has, reaching out to organizations that do have that background to kind of work together collaboratively, so you can bring in the folks that kind of do know what to look for and how to then advance the ball, so you're not trying to do it yourself. It's a lot to take on as an active one, so definitely reach out to other colleague organizations to try to kind of support your efforts. But yeah, sometimes a passionate parent is kind of all you need to get things started. So it'd be great to have more folks get involved.
So I'm going to turn to the Q&A box. Ames, I know you've answered some, but I'll pitch them to Nora and Kaitlyn as well. So here's one that's come in. It says, I work for a national organization that wants to support comprehensive inclusive sex ed and know it needs to be done at the local level. Can you provide advice on how to support that? We've surveyed our members and they too advocate at the federal level 25% more times than at the state or local level. So what are some recommendations to do some more work at the local level, I think is what the question is asking.
I think first, thinking about national organizations and where they can really show up to support work at the state and local level is using their resources to create space for folks to convene, to talk to each other. A lot of times, smaller organizations are doing the work every single day and don't necessarily have the funds for a full day meeting for folks to sit in a room with each other, build trust, and strategize. And I think sometimes the best possible thing a national organization can do is just provide that funding for that to happen. And create opportunities for people to connect with each other who are already on the ground doing the work. And so that's the first thing that comes to my mind. Create space for other people to weigh in.
Nora, Ames, any thoughts?
Go ahead, Ames, please.
I was just going to say what Kaitlyn said. And I want to just really shout out SIECUS as a convener in that regard. I know that SIECUS does a lot more than simply convene folks at the state and local levels, but it's been really great to hear from other advocates at some of the meetings that SIECUS has facilitated.
Absolutely, I would echo that. I think the only other thing I might add is, and it may not be the case, so I'm making an assumption here, sometimes it's much easier to know who your federal representatives are than who your state and local ones are. So I think sometimes even just connecting people with, it's great that we go at the federal level. What's even more impactful is to go at the local level. Here's how we do that. Here's 5 easy ways to write a letter, make a phone call, send an email, sign a petition, whatever it may be. Because I think sometimes just spelling out for people the how to can be helpful, just trying to get folks off and running at the local level, which, as Kaitlyn said, is often more impactful than everyone focusing on who's in the White House.
What I often forget to plug, and something that I wrote, is the SIECUS Community Action Toolkit that is online. It is a step-by-step guide on how to engage at the local level. It has everything from whether you're running testimony, whether you're wanting to engage with school districts, whether you're trying to rally parents and come and get parents to come to a school board meeting, whether you're trying to engage with school board members, how to ask school board members questions prior to them getting on the school board. It has questions for state legislators, questions for federal legislators. Noelle, Noelle, could you share it with all participants? Noelle just dropped, and she just did, she's awesome, just dropped in the Community Action Toolkit. It will also be available online, but it's a really great resource to engage at the local level as well. So another question that's come in, it's this question for Kaitlyn. I agree that change on the district level is incredibly important. I stopped the CPC, yay, from coming into my public school and pressured my district to adopt more accepting sex ed policies. But now that I'm working on the state level, there's much more resistance. How can we appropriately scale our work in our own districts to other districts where we don't have connection or even statewide? I'm gonna read that question again. How can we appropriately scale our work in our own district to other districts where we don't have connection or even statewide?
Yeah, that's a challenge. I think something that comes to mind for me is identifying or leveraging relationships that exist across districts. Like, are there teacher organizations where you can plug into supportive, teachers who want to show up for LGBTQ young people, who are LGBTQ folks themselves, and feel strongly about creating safe and supportive spaces for their young people? Are there other districts that have GSAs? Who are the folks running those GSAs? Have a call with them to strategize what's been working in their district. What are the challenges that they're experiencing in their district? Organizing parents and caregivers and loved ones in different districts. I saw Ames name PFLAG. That's huge. Talk to folks. Like, PFLAG groups do so much incredible work, and the chapter-based work allows itself for scaling. And so figuring out how to identify the folks who are already doing the work in their districts and creating some space to connect with each other. I think a lot of times there are assumptions that because we don't see work happening, work isn't happening. And I think particularly and I say this as someone who worked in Louisiana for many years, like, there are assumptions made about, well, I can't see it, so it's not happening. And really, sometimes the best work and the most meaningful work is work that you can't immediately see. And so before you come in, and I say this especially to my fellow nationals, before you come in and make assumptions about what hasn't happened or what has happened, know that these relationships are long game relationships, that the work that's happening happens over years, not over one election cycle, not over one ledge session. They're years long. And it's really important, it's really important to listen first. And that's all I'll say about that.
So one thing that I would add, and then Nora, I'm sorry. The one thing that I will just add is that I think often we think that we're the only ones that are kind of having this issue. And like, we try to reinvent the wheel, and like, we're like, okay, I'm in this area, I need to get something done, but no one else around me. So I'm from Alabama, worked in small parts of Alabama. I've also lived elsewhere. The thing that I will say is, while I may not see it in Alabama, someone in like Austin, Texas, that could be similar to what I've done, there are some strategies, there are some really good lessons learned, there are some best practices that someone in another district, even in another state, could be doing that I could use, that I could incorporate into my work in my own district. And so while you have access to folks like Nora, like Ames, like Kaitlyn, like myself, that you can plug in and say, hey, I am in Little Rock, Arkansas. This is the demographic. Are there other places that you have worked with that have been doing something that I could replicate in my area? That's often how I do a lot of my policies. I'll say, okay, well, this was done in Chicago. Chicago's not like your district, but this district is like yours. And this is where they've done and they've had some success. How can we infuse some of that work? And that has really helped out. And then it feels like you're not alone in this, because it can feel really lonely. And when you're getting attacked left and right, it could be really challenging. And so like there are districts that are very similar across the country, whether they're in your state or not, is one thing that I would add. Nora.
Yeah, I was just going to say two other ideas from the WISE project that I work on. One is oftentimes superintendents are very competitive, and there are superintendents that are looked to as the leader within the state. And if you can get on their good side, they'll make a call on your behalf to the other superintendents and do that introduction. And that's like worth its weight in gold. So trying to think about who your school leaderships are, even if it's at the principal level or the assistant soup level, that oftentimes can be really productive. You don't have to do the cold ask yourself. Ask a colleague to make that introduction for you. And then the other thing is to think about what is the educational infrastructure of that state. For example, there's often county offices of education, and sometimes just like using a success story from that one district you're in and go and present at the Office of Education for that county so that the other superintendents can also hear about what you've been doing can be really impactful at, you know, gaining the interest and the intrigue from other districts kind of in your neighboring area. So just a couple of other ideas.
Also, Kaitlyn has flagged SHAC, School Health Advisory Council, is another great example. So I think we have time for one more question, and it is, I work at, oh, no, sorry, I thought I had read this one already. Sorry, apologies. I work for a national tutoring company that has started providing a private school option in the last few years. As far as I know, we don't really have sex ed beyond a section in science that talks about biology, so human and animal reproduction. Any tips for the first step? Does that make sense? Okay. So I may look at you, Nora, for this one.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm talking too much. I would start by asking. So I'd survey the schools, I'd survey the parents, I'd survey the staff, and I would ask where people see are the points that need the most support. It depends on the grade levels that this private school could cover, but certainly, you know, the National Sex Ed Standards will outline K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, and 11, 12, kind of what the various critical pieces of information and skills would be. But I would start again by asking among your constituents at that school what their thoughts are about where the need exists and where they would prioritize resources and investment of time and money.
Thank you. You all please help me thank my wonderful panelists. All of their information will be available from their slides, and reach out, you know, in a very nice way. So I just throw that out there. And thank you all so much for joining us. Again, these webinars are recorded. We'll put all of the resources that we've mentioned here today, from the Community Action Toolkit to win the the in-school classroom health educator CPC guide, whatever we are calling that thing, when it gets released in a month or so. I will check in with the WISE folks to see if it makes sense to link to some of their strong resources on there. And I just want to thank you all for joining us all this week to celebrate and uplift LGBTQ plus inclusive sex education. I hope that this allows you to make your sex education in your state or your district, or even the work that you come and do here in Washington, D.C., a little bit more inclusive. So with that said, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, thank you, thank you to my panelists, and have a great day.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, SIECUS, for doing this work.
Absolutely. Honored to be with you all today. Enjoy your weekend.
All right, bye.